Oh man, I was just eating an almond. Like,
It's all right. Almonds are pretty good. I mean, if they're salted. Are they salted almonds?
no, they like dry. I'm just hungry.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Welcome to the Politics of Tyranny. We are here in episode whatever to discuss and hopefully ultimately eliminate tyranny.
That's the project. I think we can do it.
We can do it, man. Just a couple guys, a couple big ideas. And we've been discussing tyranny as a very simple, if perverse, operation, which is rule for private gain. And to explain that someone can rule for private gain requires explaining that this is something that appears repulsive wherever it is, wherever it does show itself. And so part of tyranny is the masking of tyranny. And what we've been discussing is the mechanism by which tyranny masks itself.
Which is cool because the very necessity of masking it points to the reality of human nature, right? That tyranny is unnatural.
Totally, yeah.
That's the reason it must be masked.
I've been having this this conversation in regards to technology, and it's like the point of any kind of good critique of technology is not to say like technology is evil or something. It's to say that because human nature is so good, so wonderful, that there is no evil technology that can be utilized without actually delivering some human good.
Right.
And tyranny is the same. You can consider tyranny as a kind of technology of human rule almost, which is to say that in the same way, it must deliver some kind of good. It must fake it. It must mask itself as being for the common good in some way in order to work at all.
Right.
And this is a real cause for hope. I think for people living under tyranny to know. I mean, maybe it's a little bit of a sad hope.
It's the reason why the tyrants are always paranoid.
Yeah.
Because their own mechanisms are always playing on their own undoing.
Yeah.
Right. Because they're always appealing to aspects of human nature that are grasping after true rule, just rule.
Yeah.
And so the tyrant's sort of pretending to be that in certain roles.
Yeah. Like
and so you're always playing with fire.
Oh, totally. Like you think about the way that, any tyranny that faces the competition of other tyrants has to then, especially on a national level, develop some kind of pro-family policy to get people to have families, to provide the workforce, to provide the army. But then you're playing with fire because what you're producing and promoting is, of course, units of love, and alternative sources of authority that foster the opposite ideals of tyranny.
Right. So, I mean, we talked about this when we talked about cruelty, and we talked about this is the reason why it takes on those forms.
Yeah.
But it's important that we see that what the sort of underlying principle here is that rule itself is not tyrannical.
That's right.
All right. So I think that sometimes in our discussions we've maybe missed, or we've maybe downplayed that. But it's always been there, that principle. So like when we go all the way back to the beginning, we talked about humans being social in their very natures, and that part of what that means is that mastery. So, which is a word that is upsetting to Americans maybe, but it's the word that we get from Thomas.
No gods, no masters.
Yeah. But the point is that human power over some humans over others, the power of more, the existence of more powerful people and weaker people is an essential aspect of our sociality, of what it means to be a social being. And that itself is not a problem. That's not tyranny. That's the thing that the tyrants are aping.
Absolutely. And in fact, what we want to suggest from the outset, prior to defending it, is that equality, that is to say, the denial that there's any kind of lower and higher that is the necessary condition for rule. Equality is actually another one of these mechanisms of tyranny.
Yeah, there's an irony here, but it's a serious one. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like and I want to be clear about what we're claiming here, because I think when you think of tyranny, one of the first things you think of is precisely the inequality between the tyrant and the one over whom the tyrant lords. And this is essential, right? But already you can see why equality must be in some ways a mechanism of tyranny, because the whole point is once you recognize, oh, this is a tyrant that is lording over me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then again, you start not to like it,
Right.
right? In some way. So the assertion of equality, you can already see, makes a kind of basic sense. Like there has to be some kind of assertion that that's not really happening. There has to be a mask.
Yeah, no, exactly right. So what we're getting at, what we will be getting at here, I think we're going to have to unpack this a lot.
Oh yeah.
Is that the tactic of equality, so the myth of equality or the assertion of equality is a tactic for hiding the actual deployment and efficacy of power.
Awesome.
Right? So power is really there because that's essential.
Okay, we're here. We're the pro inequality party.
That's right. No, and this is one of the most disconcerting aspects of Catholic social teaching, I think. And when I teach it with my students, it's always very disconcerting because when you read the encyclicals of the 19th century, especially, the popes are just obsessed with authority. And when they look at the errors that they're seeing in the modern world, they always boil it down to a denial of authority. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems there that we have in reading that is we read it, and it's often in this sort of archaic language and sort of alliance of throne and altar kind of monarchical language, because that's the setting, right? But we read it as sometimes we read it as sort of an appeal to divine right or an appeal to some sort of like sovereign power, or we read it as if they're advocating tyranny.
Well, I mean, you think we are red-blooded Americans here.
That's right. Yeah.
And
so we're Republican.
What's an American? Yeah, right. That. And what's an American?
I mean, a Republican in the little r sense, not
sure.
Not the big r sense.
They're just sellouts.
Yeah.
No, we begin right having cast off a king.
Yeah.
Which I think is actually awesome, but not just because we cast off a king, right? Like, so I think there's something to.
But the Pope's point is that you can extract the principle out of the particular political circumstances, right?
Oh yeah.
And so the principle is that authority in society is not only inevitable, it's desirable, it's necessary, and that to not acknowledge the desirability and the necessity of it is to pervert it into tyranny. But there's no getting out of the reality of power.
All right, let's talk about it.
Okay.
Power difference is a necessity. Now, do you mean this socially? You mean it metaphysically?
Both.
Yeah. I was just throwing you a really soft. I knew the answer. I just let you hit it. Actually, I think it's both. All right, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we begin metaphysically.
Great place to start.
And very simple. We'll do a very simple sort of outline of a hierarchical understanding.
Now, every professor, when they're like, we're going to get simple, either talks about a dog or a tree.
I'm going to talk about a tree.
Nice.
I choose tree.
All right. I mean, I think it says a lot about someone, which they choose, what they draw on the board when they're like, all right, the essence of the dog. Anyways, go ahead.
And it's like, which one? It's mostly like which do they think is more funny? Like a little oval with stick legs as a dog, or like your pitiful tree, which is just a ball with like.
They're never good. That's for sure.
I think the tree is more funny.
All right, there you go.
Anyway,
let's talk about your tree.
So, all right. So let's talk about an oak tree, just for fun. So, the basic classic metaphysical vision, Christian metaphysical vision, is that the cosmos itself is a dynamic movement towards perfection. Okay, so the movement is a movement from the imperfect to the perfect, but imperfect is not that there's something wrong with it. Okay, so this isn't, again, in modernity we have a problem with this because we think imperfect is somehow flawed, but that's not what they're saying. So you think about like an acorn would be an example. An acorn is a perfect acorn, but it's an imperfect oak tree.
Right.
Okay, so its movement from acorn to oak tree is its movement from imperfect to perfect, but each step along the way is a perfection in its own right. Do you see what?
No, what do you mean?
So like there's a perfect acorn, which is an imperfect oak. There's a perfect seedling, which is an imperfect oak. There's a perfect, right? So there's the movement into its greater perfection is a movement of ascending perfections.
Series of perfections, yeah.
Right? Now, the way in which that occurs, though, the acorn itself has no ability to move. So the acorn, we'll use the language of saying in act. It's in act is what it is. It's just sitting there. But then we'll say it has the potency to become a seedling. It has the potency eventually to become an oak tree. But when we say that, what we're actually saying is that there are other things that are in act that can act upon it in such a way to move it out of its simple acornness into its seedling, into its so what are those things? Sunlight, soil, water, right? There's other things in the cosmos in act that can activate its potencies and move it into perfection. So the point there that we're getting at is that things move into themselves through the act of things that are already higher, that are already in act.
Yes.
Okay.
Higher insofar as
have more efficacy.
Right. In
relation to it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And this is not
doing what it can't.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah. An acorn, if there's no water in the cosmos, the acorn never becomes an oak tree.
Yeah. And the only reason I kind of paused on that is sometimes I think when you hear higher, you can think that it's higher in a kind of comparative way with the acorn, which leads to all these problems. Like, is water like better than acorns?
No,
like,
only in within the context of that relation.
Right. What it's possible for the acorn. Okay.
Right. So it
becomes like a beggar to water.
It needs the gift of water, we might
absolutely.
say. Okay. So there is the point though is that even within the nature of the oak, so even for the oak to achieve its end as a perfect oak tree, it doesn't have the resources within itself as an acorn to do that.
Totally.
It requires the act of other things in the cosmos that are in act. Now, what that means is that we can't talk about oak trees without talking about all the things that potentially act upon the oak tree.
Well, and talk about everything, right?
Well, ultimately it implicates the entire cosmos. That's the point,
because there's no water is the same, like it itself.
Yeah, so you have this extremely complex cosmos of differences and inequalities.
Yeah.
Now, the way St. Thomas talks about this is that it's really rather beautiful. So he says that God, of course, is infinite. And so when God images himself in his creation, the way in which he approaches the infinity of himself, right? The way he images himself most perfectly is through diversity and inequality, because each thing that is created images God in its mode, which is just a fancy way of saying, it's like that frogs image God in a froggish way, rocks in a rocky way, trees in a tree-ish way, right?
Yeah, and you can see how only when you're talking about the creation of a material universe, really diversity is the only way we can approach imaging infinity.
Right. So you have something that you're kind of catching it from different angles, reflections of it from different angles. And the more angles you can catch a reflection of, the more sort of complete that image becomes, the reflection you're seeing.
See, it's very beautiful because it means that like wisdom, which is ultimately the contemplation of God, doesn't have a shortcut in the sense it can't just like go directly to God. The knowledge of natures of things is actually part of how you
absolutely
come to know God.
Yeah. So
how education actually works. Yeah.
so the diversity in of itself is a more perfect imaging of God. Mm-hmm. But then even beyond that, the inequality. So what we're talking about of the movement from imperfect to perfect is an imaging of God. And this is really interesting. It happens in two ways. One is that God isn't, what Thomas says is he's not just good, but part of his nature is that he imparts goodness to others. And so in this relational cosmology, everything is imparting its goodness. So it in act is acting upon the potencies of other things and elevating them into their further act, right, towards their end.
Like the water to the acorn.
The way water to the acorn. So when the water acts upon the acorn, it's imaging God as creator.
Wow.
Okay, and there's a further imaging of God in the inequality and the relationality.
So it's not just that we come look at the universe and realize God is infinite. We also realize that He is good.
He's good, and He imparts that goodness.
He's a
giver. He's a creator and a giver.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. But then it's even more interesting because the movement from the imperfect to the perfect is a continuum. Right, so the movement of the acorn to the oak we only artificially or arbitrarily divide it up into steps. It's actually just a fluid movement, and like I was saying earlier, any movement within that is perfect in its own right. Which means you have an infinite number of perfections in the movement from the acorn to the oak, and every one of those infinite number of perfections is imaging God in a different mode.
Yeah.
All right. So now within finite bounds, we're approaching infinity.
Yeah.
Right. You see, so we're approaching within the finite, we're approaching some sort of infinitely complex, infinitely variable, infinitely dynamic imaging of the divine.
Yeah.
All right. Which is the best we can do.
Well, I mean, it's not even the best we can do. It's the best he did.
It's the best. Well, it's what God does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't like to tell God what the best he can do.
Hey, it's the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah.
You know that.
But the beauty, you can start to see the majesty of this and the beauty of it. But
Yeah.
Thomas says it requires both diversity and inequality. Those are characteristics then of the cosmos.
Yeah, because if you didn't have that, the dependence of something like the acorn on the things that have what it doesn't in itself, then you would never have the image of the gift that we
right
by which we know
no
who God
and it's very there's so many pieces here. I'm trying to think of the best order, but maybe I just won't think about that. Maybe I'll just talk.
I think it's very intuitive.
Okay, so because there's
Unless you're a sinner.
So one of the things that's beautiful about it is you mentioned the gift and the way in which this whole system or this whole conception of the cosmos is really a way of conceiving gift.
Yep.
Because the thing that's in potency, the acorn sitting there, is only in potency from the direction of the water. I mean, what I mean is like the water's existence. The existence of the water is what makes the acorn have the potency. You know, like the water has to be there in act. And so imagine a cosmos where there is no water and the acorn sitting there, right? It doesn't have the potency to be an oak and then when water appears, now it does have the potency to be an oak, but nothing changed with the acorn.
Yeah. It all came from above.
It comes from above. And so when the water, in this analogy, when the water acts upon it, it acts upon it in a way that the acorn, this is getting kind of weird, but I'll just say it. The acorn couldn't demand the water because it doesn't know about water.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, but that's
so
just like
in of itself, it doesn't know that it even has the potency for water to act on it, right? So these things act as gifts from above. So the hierarchy, then the conception of the hierarchy is that it is one in which things achieve their natures through acting upon or being acted upon and acting upon that being acted upon that which is higher than them and acting upon that which is lower than them in a hierarchy. Yeah. And that's the way in which they achieve their natures.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can translate this into society rather quickly. And Thomas directly does this. Mm-hmm. So when they say things about society being a microcosm, right? This is what we're getting at here, is that one way would be to say something like the cosmos is political, because what we're seeing here is a situation in which things with more power are acting upon things that are weaker for the perfection of the whole. But the better way is to say society is a microcosm, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
We're more like the cosmos.
Yeah. So we're not. We operate like the cosmos. We're also integral to the cosmos, right? We're the perfection of the cosmos. So maybe that's a whole nother thing that we can get at in a little bit. But human beings themselves are born into a social whole, right? Into a society. And this society, like the cosmos, is characterized by diversity and inequality. There's all different kinds of people with different kinds of skills, with different abilities. And those abilities themselves are not just innate to people, though there is innate differences between people, but they're also developed by the relations that those people have with other people. So children are born, and there's many, many possibilities to any given child. Yeah. There's not an infinite number of possibilities because he has certain innate capabilities, but there's any number of possibilities. And he becomes the person he's going to become through the action of those who have more power over him, on him, throughout the course of his life. All right, so human beings act on each other. That's just another. It sounds, we say things like more power, and everyone starts going, domination, patriarchy. But what I'm saying is simply that the other human beings have efficacy on you, right? They change you, like the water and the acorn. That's all we're saying.
It is odd that we immediately I mean, we just sort of read in one of the goals, I think, of a tyrannical society into our descriptions. So we say, okay, the goal, as we've been taught, is that everyone is equal.
Everyone's the same. Yeah.
And so when we approach an obvious point at which not only is that not true, but it's fine that it's not true, like a father and a son not
Right.
equal, we're like, we view it as a problem.
Right. This is the reason. I mean, this is the reason you've written on this. This is the reason why liberalism can't handle children.
Oh yeah.
Right, because or is offended that we call our priest father, or the whole discourse of 19th century monarchy within the encyclicals, where they are continuously referring to authority as a father-like thing.
I was reading this book that was just documenting child rearing practices in America.
Mm-hmm.
It's really fascinating because the argument of the book was basically like the things we did to babies and often still do now were in relation to, he wouldn't have called it this, but to the denial of power, of that power difference. So like it used to be the case that pretty much universally that you would swaddle babies pretty tightly, like just keep them swaddled.
We do that.
Yeah. You do? Okay, well, that's fitting.
I like to display my power through the swaddle.
Right. Well, you can see why we became gradually kind of horrified by this, because part of the idea was that it was a image, right, of that power, right, of the constraint of the child, and then there became a kind of, I wouldn't say popular wisdom, but gradually there became a wisdom that the child needed to
be free
and flail about so that it could learn that it had rights, that it had its own like.
I know. So we encounter this all the time. So Sarah, my wife, swaddles our babies like crazy. I mean, and we encounter people all the time that are like, get him out of there. Blah, blah, blah. And you're like, no, you don't understand. He loves it. Like, he's all upset and you swaddle him.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
It's like, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me.
I think, and this just might be an error, like, but part of what thinking that the real thing is some future equality, and that the facts that are staring us in the face are somehow like some proto equality that just hasn't happened yet.
Right.
Is that we interpret like the movements of arms and legs as like intentional. Right. When like we know that they're not. They don't even know they have arms and legs.
Those are things that are upsetting him, and stopping that is a service to the baby. Right. Like the baby doesn't know what those things that are hitting him in the face are.
Right.
Like he doesn't know those are his own hands.
I mean, I think there's a good biblical reason to swaddle children, right? Because that's what Mary did to Jesus. I feel like that has to have some
totally
weight.
I actually think that's probably dogmatic.
Yeah. It's a dogma.
Okay.
A biblical doctrine of the church, swaddle them babies. Okay, but the reason that we are talking about swaddling, of course, is because there is this knee-jerk reaction to the idea of inequality as being not only present. I think we can kind of deal with that, but good.
Good. So, I mean, what we have to do, we keep coming back to this father-son, parent-child relationship, and it's really ideal. It's what Thomas does over and over and over again. And it's because it's where we see it most clearly, right? For the child to develop into a flourishing person, it requires the care of his parents. Yeah. And that care is well beyond material care. It's his psychological, his spiritual, his mental care. He needs to be formed by them.
Totally.
And he is in fact formed by them. Yeah. So if they're abusive, he's deformed by them.
Yes.
If they're loving and use their power appropriately, then he's formed into his perfection by them. So this movement from the imperfect to the perfect is what's occurring with the child. But the insight is to extend that outside of the family and to understand that all power differentials in society are this way. So when Thomas says just power is the use of mastery, the use of power for the good over whom it is wielded, for the common good, this is just an extension of that same parent-child relationship into society as a whole. So society, but it's not merely this sort of negative formation that power ought to be used for the common good. There's also the positive side, which is the common good or perfection can only occur through the use of power. Right. So in order to become virtuous, you require a person who has more virtue to instruct you into virtue. You cannot do it without that. Right. Like that's what part of what it means to become a virtuous person is to is part of an essential aspect of becoming virtuous is to put yourself underneath in obedience those who can lead you into virtue. And part of becoming a virtuous person is leading those who have placed themselves in obedience under you into virtue, right? So you're both a ruler and a ruled.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
Part of becoming a just person is understanding. This goes from Aristotle says this, and then Thomas picks it up. Part of becoming a just person is being able to both rule and be ruled in appropriate ways, which is justice. That's the content of justice.
Yeah. I think that there's a whole tradition when it talks about the fact that we already do this even within ourselves. So it's a social reality, but it's also like you you rule yourself. You learn to rule yourself from others who rule you.
Mm-hmm.
So to order to be a human being, you have to have in yourself both the act of ruling over, but since you're the object of it, your passions, your habits, you're also the one who's ruled.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a social reality between you and other people. It's also, I don't know, a reality of the soul.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Right? You know, the only what a human being is a ruled and ruling.
Absolutely, but then this just goes to our dominion.
Yeah,
I mean, we are kings. You know, I mean, this like we are rulers. That's what we are.
I was thinking about Genesis because there's that line that says that there were no plants upon the earth because there was no rain and no man to till the earth. And it seems obvious that the very existence of things is dependent on the existence of what's higher in order to
and what's
be
lower.
What they are. Yeah, absolutely.
So the plants, the traditional hierarchy of being, you know, goes minerals, plants, animals, man, angels.
Yeah.
And so the minerals are soil, dirt, you know, and so for the plants, and that include water. Mm-hmm. So for the plants to exist, they need both what is below them, the water, and what is above them, the men.
Yeah.
In order to be plants.
Right.
Because that's what, like, you can't, the plant's end is ultimately to be elevated into the life of reason, the life of man, and so ordered towards the worship of God, which is the end of, this is, I mean, we avoided that when we were talking about the cosmology, but ultimately this whole dynamic hierarchy of inequality, of diversity and inequality culminates in the social worlds that men build.
Right, because if you have the mineral world is brought up into the life of the plant world is brought up into the life of the animal. The animal world is ordered and brought up into the life of the human being, both in the human being and in human's relationship to the animals. And
then the human is elevated into the life of God because we're a spiritual being.
By the causality of the angels.
Through the angels.
Don't
exactly. No. Right. So
yeah.
So it's an act. This is the whole like going from God and returning to God, but it returns to God through men.
Yeah.
Right. So we're ordering the whole cosmos. But the thing to realize is that our development as persons is an aspect of this dynamic itself.
Yes.
Okay. So we build our social worlds as worlds of persons, which are not like what the person includes the social whole in which he's being formed into.
What do you mean by that?
So to describe who a person is, you have to you can sort of like infinitely abstract from the actual historical or biographical reality of the person, but that's doing it at violence to who he is, right?
Yeah.
So who he is his biography, right? So what I mean is who his father is, who his mother is, what vocation he was trained into, the way he behaved towards his brothers, the way he acts. That's who he is. He's nothing else.
Yeah.
So when we talk about human persons coming into their personhood in a relational, social way, I mean, we mean that quite literally. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that and that's how we achieve our perfection as human beings, is to move from the imperfect to the perfect, from the unvirtuous to the virtuous, as becoming a particular person with a particular biography within a certain social setting and a certain historical moment, right? Like that's what it means.
Yeah.
So this just adds more diversity and beauty, majesty to the cosmos, because human beings themselves build their own worlds.
Yeah, totally.
Right. So which world are we going to build? Well, who knows? We can build any number of worlds and then raise people into them and create persons that are native to that world.
And what's I mean, it's sort of an exciting idea, especially in that, in the same way, we use an analogy to say that the acorn didn't know, right, that it
Right.
needs the water,
Yeah.
that the act of perfecting comes from above, which is to say that which is an act is what gives beings lower than it its proper potencies.
hmm
Um, it's the same with people, right? Like, and that's where the analogy comes from. That's what I'm
Right,
saying. Like,
exactly.
it's
Yeah,
weird
yeah,
to
yeah.
talk about it with an acorn
Because
precisely
we were
because
talking about people.
it's
Yeah.
not weird to say, for instance, that the baby cannot demand what is necessary for it to become a perfect child any more than the perfect child can know already and demand what is necessary to become the perfect man, which is simply to say that it's a gift, a true gift, because it always belongs properly to the person that already has it.
Yeah, and it exceeds the capacity of the one who's receiving it. So,
Yeah.
so part of what it means to be lower.
Yeah.
I mean, this language is so hard for Americans, but it just got to stick with us here. Part of what it means to be lower or to be weaker is to not be able to comprehend the gift that could be given to you from who is higher.
Right, because if you could comprehend it, you'd
Then
already
you'd
have
be
it.
it. You'd already have it. So when we describe there being a hierarchy, what we are describing is that the demands that come up can never equal the gifts that can come down.
Totally.
Right? Like that's the very nature of it. So sometimes you'll have, and those gifts that come down, then that's what makes them gifts, is they exceed the capacity for a demand, right? Which means they exceed the possible gratitude even. So like sometimes people will go, oh, gifts can't really be gifts because you give a gift and then you get gratitude. But the whole point is that if it's a real gift, the person you're giving it to may give you some gratitude, but it's not adequate.
Well, and
Because that's what it means to be on the receiving end of a gift, is to not understand the significance of the gift.
Totally.
So your gratitude is always inadequate.
Yeah, and who hasn't had this experience? I hope
With children.
of children, right? Like, yeah, okay, maybe they say thank you every now and then because you feed them.
They have no conception of the gift they're receiving.
Right.
It's impossible for them to comprehend it, so it's impossible for them to give adequate gratitude.
Which is why they can give hierarchically increasing gratitude as they
achieve
are
perfection.
Perfected, right?
Right.
An adult can thank his father more perfectly, not perfectly, but more perfectly than a child can thank his father.
Yeah, and I think an adult can begin to maybe give the proper gratitude to his father only when he himself becomes a father.
Right, because then he has children, he says, wow, you did this for me.
Wow, you did that for me. Now I understand. You know, and parents say this all the time. You'll understand when you're a parent.
Yeah. Right,
and it's true, right? That's just like folk wisdom.
Right.
Right? You won't understand until you're a parent because that's the way hierarchy works.
People hate this. Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't mean to get hung up on the parent thing, but there's like the no child movement, sort of like it's green or whatever to not have children.
That's so okay.
It's not for clever people. It's for it's for people that are lower in the hierarchy and need the gift of.
Somebody should give them discipline.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that they do is they make judgments about parenthood, and then assessing it, say that they don't want it,
Right.
and then the response, of course, feels
You don't know what it is.
You don't know what it is until you have it, and this is frustrating to them because it can't be a transaction, right? You can't make a rational move. You can't say when you're deciding shall I have a kid or not. It's actually impossible to assess any kind of pro-con outcome the way that we would like, because we like to be rational and ordered. So we say, well, you do some things like, oh, but it would cost this much per month. Like you have these ridiculous
Right.
judgments. But the point is that you can only use the judgments from the world that you already receive,
Right.
which is that world of not being a parent.
Yeah.
Which is why you turn to things like money and leisure time.
Yeah. No,
And the difficulty of the parent then who hears this
is like you're insane.
Right, because the point is that you simply don't.
No, I mean, I think the point is just the actual
goods.
Response is just to say you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, they don't, and that's the kindest response.
Yeah,
because they don't have the child. Well, it's not even that. I mean, they don't even. Well, anyways, not the point. The point is that it's simply an example of the way in which gift operates hierarchically. That
Right.
you can even do this negatively and get stuck on a lower level because you lack, as a mature adult, the ability to recognize this fact that you actually get inaugurated into a new perfection right? Not just like the life of a single adult male is somehow it, and that's perfect, and all judgments to be made are made from that world, as it were.
But I mean, one of the things that's really beautiful and significant about this is the way we're talking about gift and hierarchy working is we can see the way in which hierarchy always images God, because to the one who's lower, who's receiving the gift from the person who's above them, that gift is always excessive to them. It's always gratuitous.
Yes.
So it bears the image of grace in it, and even of the divine. It's godlike.
Right, because you never deserve it.
You never deserve it. You can't comprehend it. And so in a sense, it's infinitely above you, right? Even though, from your sort of relative position, it feels it is. And so, because there's a qualitative difference, not just a quantitative. So there's an infinite gap, right? And so it is divine. So when the church talks about social power always being the power of God, and always being imaging the power of God and mediating God, all political power is divine power. Power doesn't come from below, it comes from above. This is just like the mantra of the 19th century. And people read that as divine right monarchy and all this. And it's like, no, that's not it. It's this idea that just power is always a divine power, and it's always coming from above. Ultimately, like it comes from above and then descends through order and a social order. That is built to elevate the lowest into the highest, right? Built to reach down and elevate up. This image then is the social image that the church was trying to counter liberalism with, right? And I really rather unsuccessfully, I'd say. But anyways, it's all there. All right, so where do we go from here? Well, one of the things to see is that the assertion here is that this sort of inequality is in the very fabric of creation itself, that this isn't something that we think is good and so we ought to have it,
or bad and so we ought not.
so bad and so we ought not to have it. This is a metaphysical assertion about the way the social reality is.
It ain't going anywhere.
Right. So given that, what happens when you assert equality? What happens when you deny the reality of this and you present the social world as if it is a world of equal actors making transactions?
This isn't obviously a hypothetical that we're making, right?
This is the liberal. I mean, this is what they do. They construct a system that denies the reality of power.
Well, yeah, maybe we should back it up and describe this a little more slowly, I think.
Okay.
Because I don't think everyone knows this. But you think about where liberalism came from. One of the sources of it is in a rewriting of, I would say Genesis, but you might also just say rewriting a description of human nature. And the way this is defined in or the way this is named in like a political class or something would be the origin myths.
State of nature.
State of nature myths, yeah.
Right.
So one of the more obvious ones is from Rousseau, right? And he's describing what were things like in the beginning? And in order to get, I think we have an innate sense that what it was like in the beginning is how it ought to be, because we are from Eden in some way. And
right.
So it's not the method. Some people complain about the method of the liberals,
we do the same thing all the time. We're always talking about Eden.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they're doing the same thing. It's just that they're wrong about Eden.
Yeah, they have an anti-Eden.
Yeah. So Rousseau's Eden is one of a lot of adults. It's really interesting because everyone's an individual that's sort of self-sufficient unto himself. And they might come together for some reason of utility to have a child or something. But then he's even got this idea that the children are they don't really need a lot of raising.
He says crazy things like, as soon as they're weaned, the mother abandons them.
Yeah, and off they go.
Which I don't know how many people have weaned a child, but
I don't know. Maybe he was weaning them at 7 for
seven.
his kids.
Okay, right,
whatever.
Weird. Okay, even so, 7-year-old's not going to survive long in the forest.
No, a 13-year-old won't. I mean, maybe a 13-year-old.
All right, never mind.
But the point is, we can read that and just laugh, haha. But it's they had to do something like this, right? Because of
Locke has his, Hobbes has his. Yeah, they all do.
They have a particular goal of describing man as equal by nature, and then for inequality to where it does exist, be either just straight up injustice, right? Like, and that seems to be what Rousseau is going for.
Same with Hobbes.
Yeah, or at the very least, it's a sort of proto, like you're just like there's something that becomes really unnatural about weakness.
Yeah, or
in
it just becomes a form of technology, right? So like for Locke, I think you get a more positive framing where it's something like we realize by working together we can achieve our ends more effectively.
Yeah, or like for Malthus, the weakness and lower level of children is precisely to develop your mind. So like you are incapable because this is not because of the necessity of relationships of love or anything like that, but because it's just a sort of psychological Darwinian process by which you're suffering the fact that you're an imperfect being.
Yeah.
You think about the difference in the Catholic view. Like you're a perfect baby, you're a perfect child, insofar as you're like we don't look at the weakness and say like, well, this is an imperfection because we're not just using one perfection as the judge for everything else.
It's not the 30-year-old independent, healthy, fully functioning adult.
Yeah, you can honestly
that's just
say
one stage.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
In a continuum of being.
Right. Exactly.
Of movement. Yeah.
So they kind of get rid of this, and then they make any stage of weakness and dependence into the kind of cocoon state for the real thing, as opposed to a level of real perfection. Okay. So
Hobbes is so insane on this, or so consistent, so brilliant in a lot of ways that he says that, well, obviously babies are born into families, right? But because of the fundamental equality of human beings, the mother or the family has the choice to kill the baby immediately and eliminate it, right? And it's only if they choose not to kill it that it then gets to live because it is defenseless against them. It's equal, but will lose the fight.
Oh, wow.
So there's no...
So it's an equal competitor in the war of all against all.
Of all against all. And so its survival from the very beginning is somehow self-interested for other people.
Gotcha. Wow.
Right.
That's horrifying.
Absolutely horrifying, but rather appropriate for our society, I think. But anyway, go ahead.
Wow. Given
the current regime.
Okay, so the point is that we live in a world shaped by this quest to create an ideal equality among men. To get
so much
rid
so,
of
the word inequality itself is this sort of nasty word.
Yes,
right?
on
You
the
just
origins
say
of inequality.
the word inequality, and everyone's like, oh, we're talking about something that's bad.
Yeah.
Right. So we're trying to render equality somehow. Now, the thing is that there's a lot of pieces to this, but so how do the liberals do it? Right. So the liberals. Maybe I'll just start describing it and then we can go off on branches from there, because the liberal tactic is to devise a system of formal equality. Yeah. So everybody has equal rights. Everybody is a citizen in the same way. The juridical order, treats everyone equally. And so you have a formal equality that is really a fictitious world, right? A fictitious world that includes every human being, every piece of property, like everything becomes a piece of property, right? We've talked about this, I think, previously, about the idea of building fictitious worlds. So they build this fictitious world where everybody is equal, and they are equal under the law. So within liberalism, the example I always give is that the 10-year-old boy working in the coal mine in 19th century England is equal to the mine owner, right? They have equal rights. They're making an equal contract. No one's being coerced. They're bringing to bear in their negotiations whatever property they have, right? This is an equal exchange legally, like formally. But you'd have to be a crazy person to not look at that and say, obviously, the mine owner has far more power than the 10-year-old boy. But the point is that within the liberal framework, that power is irrelevant. So if we just look at the formal framework, the power differential disappears. It dissolves. Right. And so you devise a method of modeling all of society that way. All of society. Yeah,
it's fascinating, right? Because whenever we describe this, it's always positively, right? So the whole beauty of equality under the law is that you can be anyone, right?
Right.
And still get pulled over for speeding, for say, just like the other guy.
Right.
We never describe it negatively, right?
Right.
You could be anyone.
Yeah, exactly. You could be the 10-year-old boy in the mine.
Yeah.
No, and that what it's doing is asserting basically that there is no positive duty or function of power, right? So like power is always, so we wouldn't, everyone is the same, and that means there's a sort of lowest common denominator kind of sameness, right? And so if you're higher in the hierarchy, in the reality of the hierarchy, right, like
You
the
have more power.
actual de facto arrangement of power,
Yeah.
you have the exact same social obligations as the 10-year-old boy who has no power.
Right.
You have the exact same social function as him. There's no difference between you.
Yeah.
Right. So what that does, if you think about the way we were just talking about a hierarchy of inequality and of gift, and the way in which those which are lower are brought up into themselves by that which is higher, this is a way of stealing, right? Because this is a way of denying that which is weaker what it needs in order to achieve its perfection, which is really the reason why the higher thing exists, is to render that gift so that the whole can move towards a greater perfection or towards the common good.
I think that's that needs more clarity. Could you give when you talk about it as theft?
Let me try.
Okay, yeah. Give me an example.
So let me think about it. Let's put it this way. So very often people will talk about rights, negative rights. Everyone has the same negative rights.
Right to free speech, the right to...
Yeah, I mean, let's say, yeah, you have things like that, the right to free speech. Even if and you say that people have, there's a sort of corresponding, or any right, even if it's a positive right, has a sort of corresponding duty on someone else's part. So to say I have the right to free speech is another way of saying that everybody has the obligation not to violate my ability to speak.
Yep.
Right. So there's a passive and active correspondence.
Yes.
But the trick of liberalism is to act like that passive, so the right bearer, and the active are equal. So I have a right to free speech, which means everyone else has the obligation not to stop me from speaking. Mm-hmm. But that is the hierarchy is exactly asymmetrical.
Yes.
So in the conceptual hierarchy conception, that which is higher owes more than that which is below can demand.
Yes.
So if I have a right to free speech, it's not merely that the active principles, active parties have an obligation not to inhibit me, but they have a positive obligation to give to me. Right? They have right? So when you reduce it to what can be demanded from the bottom, right? So you're basically saying the parent only owes to the child whatever the child's capable of demanding from the parent.
Right, which is insane.
Which may just be like food.
Right.
Okay, so it's a reduction. So you think about like the way our system works, where our check on human action is always lawsuits,
yes.
Right? And that is the passive party suing for his rights.
Yeah.
But the whole point, you can see the whole inversion in play there, because the passive party, or the one who's been somehow wronged, the weaker party, is exactly the one who's not in a position to demand what's actually owed to him. He can only demand a part of what's owed to him, because he doesn't understand. He can't be in a position to comprehend what gift could have been given. You see? So he's always demanding only a piece of what injustice is owed. And so if you order hierarchy, if you order society in that way, the more powerful are only ever sort of giving to those who are weaker a piece of what in fact is owed, only the piece that the weaker are capable of demanding. You see, does that make sense? I mean,
that
makes sense.
It makes a sort of intuitive sense in that there is no sense of obligation within those who have more power beyond what the less powerful can demand, right? Because you run into this all the time, right? Like, I don't know, like you can demand a minimum wage guaranteed you by law, but no one with power, no one who has the power of employer over employees would say that injustice, something like that, people under them are owed a wage that is, well, maybe wage is a bad, actually.
Well, no, because what you want to do is get away from quantity and talk about quality.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe it is the case that the weaker classes, we're talking about class here, I guess, the weaker classes are capable of demanding certain material benefits or material justice from the greater, the more powerful sections of society. Okay. But the whole point is that there's a qualitative difference between what the lower and the higher, the relationship between them. And so the higher might be able to concede the material benefits, but what about the moral power? Right? Like the more powerful elements in society don't just owe material well-being to the lower. They also owe intellectual development. They also owe moral guidance. Wow. They also owe an elevation into the spiritual truths.
And nobody thinks
they also owe, right? Like they have more power, and that power, and they may in fact be more educated. They may be more sophisticated spiritually, even. They may be more sophisticated morally, and all of those things are things that would have to be donated down in a way that the people it's being donated to wouldn't know that they needed it.
Wow.
Right? And so by not giving that, they're stealing from the poor.
Right.
So this becomes very politically incorrect, of course, because we're start talking about aristocracy essentially.
Yeah. Well,
right.
The conception is for Americans is that everyone's the same, so that the poor already have everything they need, and the difference between like a poor person, a middle class person, a wealthy person is in fact the amount of money that they have. Like it's a bank
which
number.
Is just a vision of the hierarchy from below.
Yeah.
From the most base, the lowest common denominator, right? Food. Right, that's what I'm trying to get at. And so when you think of hierarchy as an elevation into perfection, which is an increasing in power as it elevates, then it's not just, you can't reduce it to the lowest common denominator. The elevation is an elevation beyond each step into a higher one. So you can think about this with things like why is it that as liberalism has sunk more deeply into our consciousness, that it seems that the moral life, the capacity for human flourishing among the lower classes has plummeted to a much greater degree than seemingly that among the upper classes. I mean, for example, you take something, for example, like the institution of marriage, right, where it's becoming an upper class institution or an upper middle class institution, and it's becoming all but extinct among the lower classes. Now, why is that? Right? It's not because the upper class is more religious. Right? I mean, in fact, statistically, it's different. The lower class is more religious, right? If you survey them.
I've heard it more associated with college education.
Yeah, so there's
college-educated people more likely to get married, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens is that those disciplines have whatever it is that the values that those middle and upper classes are pursuing. So whether it's material success, stability, some notion of contentment, whatever the values are that they're pursuing, they've determined that marriage is something that's conducive to the pursuit of those values, and so they build the social disciplines necessary within themselves in order to facilitate that institution. Right. But what they're not doing is reaching down to the lower classes and elevating them up into that institution. They're abandoning them.
Well, that's what's really fascinating, because what that would look like couldn't be giving marriage to the lower class as it's conceived of in that middle class way. So what I mean is, for example, you just described marriage within a middle class society as being a sort of, I mean, and this is in some ways, like there's goods here, so I don't want to just say that I think it's like all a sham or something.
There's a lot of goods that the middle class is pursuing. Right.
And so some of these goods, it's like the rational choice of goods for security, stability, understanding the certain joys that come with having children, and then companionship, all these things.
Right.
But to simply take that as it is understood within a class of people that have more power, and translate it, or not translate it rather, to the lower class would and is a failure, right? So like the point is,
that's right. That would be like trying to instruct a novice by going straight to, like, assume everything is just. It's like when you begin with a novice, you have to meet them where they are, right? You don't just introduce them to the highest level of the discipline immediately.
Well, but this is fascinating to me, right? Because with the marriage example, what it would mean is, what would be effective would be to give the poorer classes religious instruction, because as you said, they're more religious,
right?
I mean, there's perversities here. Like, they shouldn't not be religious in the middle class. But the point is that what is effective is to say that God wants you to marry, premarital sex is a sin. I mean, these things that are precisely what the middle class won't do are the things
but why
that
won't they do it? Because it inhibits their freedom. See, because what's happening is that it's not that what we don't want to say is that the way the middle class imagines marriage is like the right way.
No, absolutely
right.
not.
And because what's actually happened is what they've done. I mean, we're talking in generalities here, but what seems to have happened is that they've extracted the concept of marriage out of any sort of hierarchical understanding of the cosmos, any sort of religious conception, any sort of pursuit of truth, and have just said, how does it affect us? Right? How is it useful for us? How is it? And that itself. So if they were just people, the way they lived marriage would be a participation in the truth of marriage as a whole, which would mean that they would look at the poor and understand. They wouldn't be somehow whitewashing it or modifying it or distorting it somehow.
They would really
say, here's what marriage does. They would really instruct them in marriage, right? And provide social guide, sort of guidance and laws.
But where I think this is funny is that you actually see them trying to instruct, not everyone, only now and then you see people trying to instruct those with less power in the joys, or not even the joys, in the utility of marriage, as if they're on the same level. So what I mean
Absolutely,
is,
right.
I've seen this happen. Right? I've seen people say, like, don't you know that married people on the large are happier? Don't you know that marriage is actually associated with lower suicide rates or something like that? I've heard this preached. Like, me too. Why get married? Well, you're less likely to kill yourself.
I actually heard on the radio some guy who was on there talking at length about how, I can see if I can remember this, but it was basically like, in America, if you just do 3 things, you won't be poor. And it was like, graduate from high school, hold a job for at least 6 months, and get married. It was like, if you do those 3 things, you won't be poor. As if the reason, like, as if you're not just describing not being poor. Right. Like, as if like
poor people are people that don't do those things.
As if like doing those things are what renders you not poor, instead of just poor people are the ones who don't do those things.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Like, this is just
which is why the preaching is such a failure.
Right.
Because what you're saying is really like, hey, these things that you, for whatever reason, you lack the power to do. Like, this is the de facto reality. Like, do those things.
Yeah.
It's
and
like,
then you won't be you anymore.
What I need.
Then you'll be us.
Right. But what I need, as the poor person looking up in the actual social hierarchy, is for you to give me what I don't know.
That's right. Yes.
That I need.
That's right. Yeah. 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 And
to speak it into my language, and to speak it into
to
where
guide,
I'm at,
to give care,
which is to talk about,
to give care, right? And so, we're talking about a sort of material hierarchy, but in a just society, it would be a hierarchy of virtue that would map onto social power, including material power. So we got to have some sort of conception of that. But what we're getting at there being an injustice here is that the American, we're talking about the American middle class as being powerful, which I think it is. So the American middle class and upper middle class, by not providing the moral law, by abandoning the moral law themselves,
yes,
by not giving it to the poor, they're abandoning it, which means they don't have to follow it. All right. So they don't need it in order to achieve their ends of middle class family, because, are they having premarital sex? Well, of course, but they're doing it safely, and they're doing it prudently, and they're not making any stupid mistakes, right? Because that would get in the way of going to college and getting a degree, and our family doesn't do that. So let's have a talk about safe sex, right? And so it's It's not the morals is not the morals that are surrounding the institution of marriage. The morals are the morals that are surrounding the goals of the class that you're a member of, right? And so it's wrong to mess up your progress into middle class success,
right? Which is why it's not wrong to have premarital sex. It's wrong to get pregnant and not have an abortion.
But that is exactly that then doesn't translate to a different a socioeconomic situation. Right. And so by abandoning morality in itself, they get the ability to have premarital sex as much as they want. The middle class does. Yeah. Because then they can do it smartly and rightly, and they don't have to worry about, and then the poor, of course, don't do it smartly in the sense that the middle class would think of it as being intelligent. So they become, by denying the moral instruction that needs to permeate society, they're stealing from the poor. They're gaining the ability to do whatever they want by not providing that to who's below them. And this is a form of stealing. Yeah. It's an injustice. They owe it to what is below them.
Yeah, and it's so and it's so malicious in that, having stolen by refusing the gift that they're obligated to give in justice to the poor, they then turn at the poor and despise them precisely for not having the gift they were supposed to give.
They were supposed to give them, yeah. So
look at you, having kids out of wedlock.
Yeah. Don't you know that's bad for your
like you said,
business success?
It's going to make you poor.
It's going to make you poor, yeah.
Look at it. It's making you poor right now, poor person.
So and this is all, again, everything we're saying here, I think, is very true, and it's very politically incorrect. I mean, it's very
because what you're
saying, we're triggering things here, because what we're talking about is there being social inequalities that are real.
There are real inequalities, and there's a paternalism here.
Yes, there's a paternalism here.
Right? Like, you have a duty to those who are really actually weaker, less smart, less intelligent,
educated, less culturally developed, less all of that. That's right. Right. And that is it's analogous to the parent-child relationship, and that is a very offensive to people, obviously, but it's unfortunately for them true.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think we have this, and maybe this gets into where this becomes a mechanism of tyranny, right? Because we have this this reaction that says the reason that a kind of paternal model is inherently suspect is because, in fact, we really are equal.
Right.
So what's wrong about, like, because you can describe the paternal model without saying the word and just say, like, it is right to give power to those who don't have it so that they can be perfected. I think most people would be like, that sounds good. Right. But the problem with that is what you're not saying is that those people, in fact, don't have it. Like, they don't.
That's right.
That's where the paternal model.
But the whole thing, the thing that maybe is being missed is that this Christian conception, this, I think, Catholic conception, is based upon the utter conviction in the equal dignity of all human beings, right? So the reason we can look at a child and say, of course, his parents owe him love and care and education and direction, is because he's a person of equal dignity and worth as them. Right? Like, that's the reason we say hiding the power structures, masking it, is wrong. Like, what we actually have to do is identify it, call it out, put like in the Middle Ages. So you've talked about this recently. Like, put some different clothes on him so we can identify him and say, there's the powerful guy. What's he doing for the poor?
There's the middle class.
The powerful guy. There's the people who have that ability. Are they serving society properly, or are they not? Right? Instead, we hide it. We mask it.
We say that everyone's equal,
which provides cover for the powerful. That's the point. That's the reason. That's the way in which it's a mechanism of tyranny, right? Is it provides cover for power.
You know, I see this sometimes, like, really little. And I'm not trying to go back to class all the time, but it seems like there's this bit within kind of liberal economics that says that the reason that you're either rich or poor is always a matter of work. So, like, the rich are successful.
Right.
The poor, in order to be successful, should pull themselves up from their bootstraps is the kind of oddly lingering metaphor.
Which is funny because it's impossible.
Well, of course. Like, that's the definition.
It's like a joke, right?
It's like lift yourself up in a bucket.
I know.
So in the very word. It has the destruction of what ought to be,
Right.
which is that those who are in fact capable of pulling someone up have an obligation to do so and do.
Right.
So instead, we're saying, well, we're all equal, so we have to somehow rise through this hierarchy ourselves because there is no inequality, which means there's no one obligated to help.
That's right.
And what's fascinating about this is you look at like billionaires or whatever, and the description of like how a billionaire got to be a billionaire is something that fascinates us. Like we make whole magazines on this. Precisely because we think their success is emulatable, because we think we're all equal. So we can read how Bezos did it, and then kind of emulate this ourselves. Like here's the habits of wealthy people. The presumption being that they're just like everyone else. Therefore, just do it yourself, and you can be them too. Get it.
Right. It's just another version of that. Do these 3 things, and you won't be poor.
But what's insane about it is then when you actually read it, what gets hidden is the actual inequality whereby they were obligated to help others rather than just pursue profits and become billionaires themselves. So you're reading about Bezos and then you're like, well, he started out with a $1 million loan from his parents. And it's like,
yeah. I know.
Hold up. So maybe it wasn't just getting up early, having that go get 'em positive attitude or whatever. And I think I'm not just trying to
But that's part
rag
of it,
on it, because
though.
what I'm not saying is like it's wrong for there to be that inequality to begin with.
No,
The
right.
church
I
is
was
saying
just going to go
the church is just saying, look, the inequality is there. It's there from the beginning.
Yeah. So this is a good thing for us to talk about the error in the other direction then, because the liberals, like we've said, produce this formal equality which masks the material inequality, but the people on the left recognize inequality, they recognize material inequality, and then they try to devise formal inequality in order to create material equality.
Yes.
Right. So they say, because there's real inequality, we're going to devise formal mechanisms that treat that basically, in the simplest form, would be to redistribute power from the powerful to the weak, redistribute wealth from the wealthy to the poor. And so we're going to create formal inequality. We're going to treat different people in a different way, legally different, but the outcome is going to be material equality.
Same as the liberal,
which is the same. It's just the liberal error again, right? Yeah. So they are again. This is why socialism, I really think is really something that emerges only from within liberalism and is a sort of form of liberal self-hatred, and is not in fact like a serious critique, right? Because it also has this idea that that politics as a whole will be dissolved in equality, right? So we'll dissolve the reality of power structures. We'll somehow get there. That's the objective. Whereas I think the Christian understanding is that no, power structures are the beauty of the cosmos. Like this is like we were just talking about in the beginning of this talk. Like the hierarchy, the diversity, the inequality is what makes us image God more perfectly. This is our perfection, not a bug. It's not something that has to be healed. Like our politics is not just some sort of just like healing our wounds, or our politics isn't just like dealing with faults or failures. Our politics is us being human beings, like what we are political beings. And we image God in our politics, which is our deployment of power for each other.
Well,
right?
What's amazing about this is like the Catholic vision is so personal. Like the demand of socialism and liberalism is always in the end, okay, perfect the system, whether it's the legal system or the system of distribution that will achieve material equality. But if it's the case that this will never get over actual power differences in society, then any vision, the Catholic vision is what we're discussing, but any vision that acknowledges that and deals with them and says, okay, that's the what we're dealing with, not some fictional equality, whether as an end state or a formal sort of description. That is going to always call particular people to task in having obligations of justice.
Right.
Because
it gives justice meaning, is what it does.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
It puts meat on justice.
Right. I know, because anyone can demand equality. In fact, I've noticed that the people that are benefiting from massive inequality are often the people that are most for theoretical equality.
Right.
Like there's no one that wants that sort of vision more than those who are benefiting from it not being enacted. And the and it's funny because you don't have to do much. You don't have to do much or anything at all, really, to say, yes, we should have equality, but you do have to do a lot if you think that the fact of inequality has built into it the obligation to give.
Right. So I'll bring up one example here that's like totally baffling to Americans, I think. So the church all the way through the 19th century and into the 20th century just resoundingly rejected the idea of free speech, right? Of a right to free speech.
Cool.
In like no uncertain terms.
Based, as the kids would say.
Yeah. Okay, so this seems really upsetting to us. What's going on? But it's based upon all the stuff that we've been talking about. So what they're saying is, if you think about this reasonably for a second, it's like, okay, we're going to have the universal right to free speech. So this is a universal negative right that is equal to everyone. Mm-hmm. So now we just have this big open field of speaking. But if power is real, what that means is that the people who are most skilled, have the loudest megaphones, are most good, are best at rhetoric, who are best at visual stimulation, who are best, they're going to rule, right? Like, so there's no responsibility to what you say. Everybody can say whatever they want. Well, what that means is that the people who aren't good at saying things are going to lose.
Yep.
Right. So what that's actually doing is providing cover for demagogues.
Yeah.
Right. For propaganda, for mass marketing, which is obviously what we have. And so when the church said there can't be a right to free speech, they didn't mean that what they were talking about was the obligation of the powerful to speak truly. They weren't talking about whether or not you or I have the right to talk about our politicians. They were talking about, does Facebook have the right to massively lie to us all? No. Right. And this is a moral. This is a moral claim. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They do not have a right to say lies. Yeah. Right. And that's a metaphysical assertion. Right. I mean.
Yeah, because there will always be people that are better at speaking.
They have power, and their power consists of language and images. Yeah. And that power must be used for the common good, or it is wrong. And you can't have a right. You could have a juridical right. I mean, you could have a positive right, but you can't have a human right.
I feel like you have an inkling of this coming from the left when the right uses the defense of free speech for obvious, like cynically.
Yeah.
Like I said something horrible and cruel and, evil, inciting violence or something. This is how usually the left conceives of it, is like, you don't have a right to free speech in this instance because your speech is actually not, well, what they have to do is this move where it's no longer speech at all. It becomes this other thing.
I know, but that's because they can't accept what the church has always said,
which is that there's no right to free speech.
Yeah. And so they have to do this weird shift where now that's an act of violence, physical violence somehow.
Right.
The right has the same problems, right? So like now the right to free speech, but how do we feel about pornography? How do we feel, and I mean, I think that that's not really speech, because free speech is about politics, not about, this kind of stuff. And the point is both sides are kind of right in their own, their own way. Right.
Well, because what they're seeing is what they lack.
Yeah.
Which is namely the ability to say that you shouldn't lie to people.
You shouldn't lie to people. You shouldn't manipulate people.
You should be punished for lying. You should be ostracized.
Yeah. Yeah. And now the church always said that the juridical, like the positive statutory ways in which this pursuit of justice is instantiated is a matter of political prudence. Right. But there can't be some sort of metaphysical right here.
Right. So like maybe you can conceive of a society determining that it's prudent to allow for falsities insofar as they can be understood as not mattering that much, like not actually affecting like people because of the relationships of power.
Yeah, and St. Thomas talks a great deal about this, that you can't outlaw all vices.
Right. Yeah.
Not because all vices aren't outlawable; they all are. But it's imprudent to do so, right? For the pursuit of the common good, and there's all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, it's actually why he says that we were given one of the reasons we were given a divine law is so that all the vices, at some level, would be condemned.
Yeah, and they're always capable of being outlawed in the right circumstances. Yeah. So, this sort of, I mean, I think that what we're talking about with free speech operates with the whole battery of negative rights.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so what you're kind of doing is clearing the space for the powerful to win.
Oh, totally.
So,
you know, one place that I've noticed, like whenever you create a neutral space, you're essentially masking the real power difference at the same time. Because if everyone is just sort of doing the same thing, then why treat any one person any differently? So this is why this accrues onto tyranny, because you can obviously, as a charismatic person, use free speech, you know, as we can see, in order to rule others.
But I mean,
but you see this also in one way that I see it is like you give the poor certain rights in this negative sense, and then it's always seemed apparent to me that people that have more power are the ones who are more able to actually get the goods that those rights are supposed to protect. What I mean is, like, who actually wins court cases in America?
Yeah, right. The ones
people that can afford good lawyers, right? Like, who actually benefits from, you know, well, I guess that's all I'm saying, really, is that there's always, since power is always real within that neutral space, the people that can bring that power to bear, not like somehow the right itself to bear, but to exert power on the assertion of a negative right, actually have it more successfully.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I think it's probably apparent to everyone the extreme danger in all of the stuff that we're speaking here, because you start talking about power as being real, power as being efficacious, power as being unavoidable, power, and you get to the point where you have to come to a realization that constitutions are not going to save us, right? That legal structures are not, like, you don't design and implement kind of constitutional social structures and then take the people and put them in there and then see how they operate, right? Like, that's impossible. Those structures themselves are built out of power, right? And so the point becomes that the only way out is moral power, right? There is no systemic, there is no sort of statutory, constitutional, legal solution. There's no checks or balances that could be constructed. There's no, like, that's not going to work, because de facto power is de facto, right? And so, and this is why the church, this is why the popes just over and over and over again say in their encyclicals, in the social encyclicals, that by the end, they always say the only solution is a return to the moral law. The only solution is a return to Christ. The only solution, right? And there's no sort of mechanism that stops the switching from virtue into vice on a social scale. Like, virtue is always vulnerable to vice. You know what I mean? Like the virtuous society is always vulnerable to the vicious one. And you have to just win the moral fight. You know. Now, within a society that is generally moral or generally immoral, there's all kinds of legal restrictions that can come into play. But my point is that in the end, we're talking about a matter of conversion here, and not a matter of having the right constitution.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you pass a bunch of laws saying that the rich have to do this and that for the poor, they'll just become, and that's all you're doing is passing a bunch of laws, that just becomes more terrain for de facto power to move.
Totally. Because how are you going to punish them? You're going to fine them?
You got to, yeah. What I mean,
guess who can pay the fines?
Eventually end up against. You eventually reduce it to the people who actually have power.
Yeah.
So that's not the way. That's not the solution here. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, and isn't this sort of like the historical failure of socialism? Is that it always created some kind of power structure that had the de facto power to administer and enforce the material inequality.
Yeah, I mean, this is what that's
like, who gets powerful? The state gets powerful, but the state is really
the socialist
people.
Experience is the best to see exactly what I'm talking about, right? That you just adding layers of de jure power that are just populated by the same corrupt, powerful classes that were corrupting the previous one. Right. So now it's like, oh yeah, we were being run by a bunch of corrupt capitalists. Now we're being run by a bunch of corrupt commies.
Yeah. Same as the old boss.
Same as, yeah. It's just like, what? Yeah, the powerful people are corrupt. Right. And so the change of our system didn't do that. It just made it worse.
Right. The solution is that they are no longer corrupt.
Yeah. It's the only solution.
Well, I mean, but that's what's, I think, terrifying to the ideologies is that the only solution is the power of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely what has been excluded sort of a priori.
Yeah, no, and that's right. And I think that maybe a good way to end this conversation would be to kind of revisit a little bit when we talked about the church in the previous one, because we were talking, people asked whether there's a church of tyranny. And one of the things, and we were talking about the way in which the church, the way in which a just society can appropriate tyrannical forms for just reasons and all this kind of stuff. And that's all true. But the more positive side is sort of what we're talking about today, that power and hierarchy is not always some sort of an appropriation of tyranny, that it's the exact opposite, that tyranny is abusing, stealing and abusing the natural power hierarchies that exist in human society. And so the fact that there's inequality, the fact that there's some people with power over others is not some indication that there's tyranny. Right. So we got to be very clear on that in all of these discussions that we're having.
It's an indication that justice is possible.
Yeah, exactly right. The gift is possible. Right. Like every gift is a gift from someone with more to someone with less.
Right. And when we were speaking of the church having a sort of check on tyranny, it's that it makes the decision to dress up those power differences, to point them out and to
expose them.
Right. And to really clearly list out their duties. I mean, you think about the kind of obligations of the aristocratic class, and we only seem to view this cynically. Like we only have a lens of like,
it's so unfair, actually, historically speaking.
Right. That's what I mean. Well, I mean, just think about how long it was actually present in society.
Yeah, centuries.
We're talking about centuries of people acting according to the obligation so that any kind of abuse was possible.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like we get it wrong. We think like the thing exists because of the abuse, for the sake of real abuse of hierarchy, abuse of power. But it's like, no, only because we're all declaring that the thing exists do you, looking back on history, even have the ability to recognize when the power was being abused.
Right. That's right.
Like, oh, those nobles aren't acting very noble. It's like, well, why were they called nobles?
Why'd they talk? Yeah,
Do we have nobles? No, so we don't expect anyone to be noble. So we don't have anyone to blame. We don't have anyone to argue against when like Bezos, who is obviously
do you know how
noble.
Crazy this like? So I'm a medievalist by training, right? And so I'm constantly engaging medieval historians who make this exact error. So for example, the fact that in the source material you see clergy all the time complaining about like corruption or immorality, that means that it was all corrupt and immoral. And it was like you're saying like a society that is obsessed with its own failings, that just like is always talking about its own failings. Like that's evidence that it's a failure.
Yeah.
It's like, that seems to be evidence that it's really concerned about doing right.
Yeah. Totally.
Like it's like really obsessed about identifying and talking about the places where they're failing. Totally. Right. Like we don't do that.
Not at all. No, yeah, I mean, and this is just to speak on a whole structural level of like tyranny hiding itself, right? Because if you have evil being done by people who have more power over people who have less, rule for private gain,
right?
Then it's precisely the lack of any image of that happening that indicates that it's been successful.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the fact that we have to sit here kind of thinking like,
in what way is Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, who is our tyrant? Do we really have tyrants, or is it just sort of a?
Instead of it just being obvious that the billions that are being extracted from Chinese slave labor is wrong,
and yet we look back at someone in, then we look back at someone in history, and he happens to be wearing a crown and like a big robe,
and now we judge him,
and we're like, oh yeah, that's power.
What a corrupt bishop! That's so nasty. It's like, because bishops shouldn't be corrupt,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know that he shouldn't be corrupt. You have no idea. You have no idea that the middle class shouldn't be corrupt.
Right. You don't even know what it would look like, because you don't know what it being just would look like.
Because we don't know. We have assigned to it no particular obligations.
No social obligations except for caring for itself.
Mm-hmm. In fact, that's kind of what defines middle class.
Yeah, I mean, we're being kind of hard on them,
but
there's a lot of good things going on there. But
okay, well, there it is. So the assertion of equality where it doesn't exist is a mechanism of tyranny, right? Because it allows power once again to mask itself, and in masking itself masks its duties and obligations. So the historical response of the church has always been to assert that power is real from the very beginning, that it is in fact the way that things are brought to greater perfection, metaphysically, and then obviously in the
Socially.
microcosm
Yeah,
of the
and they say
social order.
this crazy stuff like all power is from God.
Well, I think about like
we're like, yep.
well, I mean, this is. I always say maybe we'll end on this when I just have a new idea because it seems mean to wrap it up and then say something. But like,
Okay.
but don't you think this is like the weirdness of our interpretation of that passage in Romans, which I'm sure someone knows the chapter, where it says that all authority comes from God? Because when I
you go no, what about the tyrants?
Well, but what I experience is people who become very, very Christian, very Catholic, looking at that and saying like, well, okay, so no matter what they're doing,
it's good.
It's good.
It's divinely sanctioned.
Yeah.
It's like the opposite.
The opposite
the meaning
must
is
be
the
the
opposite.
Case. Yeah. Precisely because it is from God, it has to be in
godly.
service to the weak.
Yeah.
Which is what Christ came to say. I mean, he said the Son of Man came to serve and not to be served. And then all of society, in becoming more Christ-like, takes on that image. Yeah. Rule becomes defined, known as rule, in being for the service of the weak.
Right.
I mean, we take this as just like I don't know, we take it as a given. We don't see it as an achievement of Christianity. And so then we look back and then we look at this passage and we actually read it in a very, I would say we read the Romans passage in a very liberal way because we think of it constitutionally. Mm-hmm. We're like, well, this person has the office of emperor.
Therefore
his actions are divinely sanctioned.
So we have to do whatever he says.
So
I encounter this all the time in class, and all I have to do is bring up Hitler. And everyone's like, wait a minute.
So is his power from God? Well, insofar as it was authority, it's like, yeah, but that's what we're saying.
That's what I'm saying, yeah. Insofar as it was authority, so insofar as it was just, insofar it was contributing to the common good.
Insofar as it served the weak.
Yeah. Which is not much for Hitler.
Yeah, no, people do this all the time, and I read it in Paul, and then they have the audacity to be like, and Paul was probably talking about Nero at that point. It's like, yeah, it was a critique.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, okay.
All right, we got our jabs in. Here we are. So, so give the lie to equality wherever you see it masking itself. Instead, recognize
your own power.
Yeah, totally.
Like, man up.
Yeah, you live in a world of unequal relationships, which means that you have an obligation to give the power that you have.
Recognize your own power and hold other people who have power to account. I mean, I think that's the message.
Alrighty. Until next time, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.